Hello, and welcome to the Source of Life podcast, a podcast on water history in the ancient and medieval Middle East. The bathhouse is an iconic feature of the medieval Middle Eastern city. But how did this come to be? Today's episode looks into the origin of bathing culture in the Middle East by going back to the Roman, late antique, and early Islamic development of bathhouses. Join us to find out about the invention of underfloor heating and what you might learn from jewellery discovered in the drainpipe of a Roman bath. With me to discuss this are Dr. Nathalie de Haan and Dr. Sadi Mareschal. Nathalie de Haan is an associate professor in ancient history at Radboud University in the Netherlands in the Department of History, Art History and Classics, as well as RICH, the Radboud Institute for Culture and History. Sadi Mareschal is a senior postdoctoral researcher of the Research Foundation Flanders, based at the Department of Archeology at Gent University in Belgium. A very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with Nathalie first to talk about Italy in the early Roman period and the Imperial Roman period. And then we'll move on to Sadi to discuss how bathing culture developed in late antiquity after the adoption of Christianity and in the wider Roman Empire, including the Middle East and North Africa. And hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about developments following the Arab Muslim conquests of the Middle East. But before we dive into the content, first I'd like to hear a little bit about your intellectual journey. So how did you both come to work on the topic of baths? Nathalie, what's your story?
I was very lucky as an undergraduate student of classics and classical archaeology because Radboud University had a project running in the Vesuvian cities in Pompeii and Herculaneum. And I was lucky enough as a young student to be able to join in summer and work with PhDs and senior researchers who did various types of research in Pompeii and Herculaneum, mainly architecture. There was one colleague already who was very interested in water supply and the disposal of wastewater. But my interest in the first place were the houses of Pompeii. I was fascinated by this idea of people living in more or less the same kind of houses that we are used to and still very different houses. So my first idea was to study the kitchens of a number of these houses. And then wisely my master thesis supervisor said it's a wonderful subject, but it's way too big for a MA thesis. And I thought, connected to some of these kitchens I had seen already, there were also bathrooms, bathing rooms, something going on there in connection with these kitchens. So starting with the kitchens, my next proposal was to study the baths. And then my supervisor said, that's a wonderful subject. Had he known before that there were over 30 private baths in the houses of Pompeii, he probably had said no, but that was my luck. And that's where it all started. Then I wrote a PhD thesis on Roman private baths in Italy, North Africa, and England. And ever since then, I stayed with the baths.
So you've been immersed in the bath, as it were, for quite a long time and really from very close to the beginning of your academic career. And Sadi, how did you come to plunge into the bath culture?
Well, very much like Nathalie, I was also very lucky as a student to be involved in the excavation of a Roman bathhouse. And it was actually with the French archaeological mission in Libya, in the eastern baths of Leptis Magna. And so my first excavation experience was actually inside a Roman bathhouse. And then another stroke of luck was that my own alma mater, so Gent University, had a new European project in Amaya in Portugal under the supervision of my future promoter, Professor Frank Vermeulen, also in a Roman bathhouse. And so I was also able to attend the excavations of the Roman bathhouse in Amaya. And so I had these both excavation experiences in Roman bathhouses, and I was fascinated by these types of buildings. And so my promoter, Frank van Meulen, suggested that I do my master thesis on the Roman baths in the Iberian Peninsula. And that's how I started my research. And then once I had finished my master's at Ghent University, I had this idea of deepening my knowledge and doing a PhD on Roman baths. And so I contacted Nathalie de Haan first to apply in the Netherlands for an Oikos scholarship, and then eventually at Ghent University, who funded me with a special research fund to start a PhD on the late antique baths in Italy, North Africa, and the Middle East.
Great. So we have with us then Nathalie, specializing mainly in Italy, as I understand it, and Sadi, who's worked in Iberia and North Africa, and also quite different periods, as I understand it. But let's get straight into Nathalie now. What periods do you mainly work on? You work on the early Roman period and the Imperial Roman period, is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. So what years is that roughly?
From the 2nd century BCE onwards until the late 1st century CE, 2nd century. But my latest project, a huge public building in Pompeii, bath building, is from the late 1st century.
Okay. And so let's, before we get down into the nitty gritty, can we just have a few definitions? So, what different kinds of baths and bathhouses existed in the ancient world? And how would we define a Roman bath? What makes Roman baths distinctive?
There is a wide range of bath buildings, bath houses in the Roman world from the very start, I would say. So the phenomenon of bathing in public already starts in the late 3rd century BCE until the late imperial times. And it didn't disappear, as Sadi knows better than anyone else in this room. A wide range from small neighborhood baths. So I'm speaking about the public buildings right now. So apart from the private baths that the elite had built in their houses and villas on the land, if we talk about public baths, the range is from very small neighborhood baths around the corner, perhaps in the apartment building you were living, and then you would go downstairs and go to the small public bath there, to the huge imperial thermae in Rome, in Carthage, and in a number of other important imperial cities. And these were buildings that were usually commissioned and financed by the imperial court, by the emperor and his entourage directly or via local elites. So there's an enormous variety, I would say, both in the scale but also in the facilities offered.
So what are the main elements that make a Roman bath distinctive? If you're looking at the architectural plan or the elements in a text that are mentioned, what would allow you to say, yes, that is a Roman bath, that really fits the sort of ideal type?
The elements that are more or less standard are a cold room, a tepid room, lukewarm room, a warm room with a very moist atmosphere, comparable to a Turkish steam bath, and a very hot and dry room in some cases, but not in all cases, a room comparable to a sauna, a Finnish, a Scandinavian sauna. So a very high temperature, but also a very dry atmosphere. These are the elements, and then connected in some of these or a number of these buildings also connected to sports. So an open field outside where the male visitors of that building could exercise. This was something that was, well, men were supposed to exercise physically, but this was not meant for women, although, and this is also a little bit shifting in research over the past few years. If we look at some of the images, for example, mosaics, we also see women playing ball games, for example. So as always, the division is not as strict as one might think on first sight. But these elements, so the idea of going from a normal temperature with bathing facilities, the cold room, to a warm room, but with all kinds of flexibility according to your own preferences. So, in this sense, there was a routing, but people were free to pick their own favorite way of bathing. So, some people might, for example, go to the warm and watery room first and skip the dry, very hot room, and others would spend a lot of time in the lukewarm room because it's a nice temperature and you have a chat and you stay for a couple of moments longer there. So there was a variety in also the use of the baths. And then the very large buildings had a number of all these rooms, so series of warm rooms and series of cold rooms, depending on the expected number of visitors.
Right, fascinating. So, but what was the purpose of all this? Why did people do it? What was the function of going to the baths? What did they get out of it?
The function of going to the baths was, as I see it, for many people twofold. So, yes, you would go there for bodily hygiene, at least that was the idea. But these buildings, and especially the larger establishments, were also very much social hubs. So, this would be the place to relax, to meet people, to see friends, to have a chat. And of course, the one function doesn't exclude the other one. So, yes, there are distinct uses. If you would go to a small facility with not too many other facilities, getting clean would be the main reason, but you could still meet friends and talk to other people. And in the large bath buildings, this idea of spending a whole day or a large part of the day to relax, to hear, for example, also a lecture after or before going to the bathing part of the building, and then have a small meal or try to get somebody to make somebody invite you for a dinner. All these kind of activities and ideas and hopes and dreams can be found in our written sources.
I like the idea of trying to get someone to invite me for dinner. Is that something we have in the text? People angling for favors in.
Yes, we have first century poems by Mareschal, a well known satirical poet from the late first century, and he has a number of epigrams alluding to this fact that some people might hang around in the past for ages in order to, well, hoping for an invitation. If there was still one place left, that they would be the person that got an invitation from a patronus. So this is also very much about social relations, who is seeing whom, who is inviting whom. And people, if we read Marshall, you really get the impression that, and of course it might be a little bit exaggerated, but the very fact that Marshall refers to this kind of behavior must somehow also relate to reality, because otherwise the humor doesn't work. If people would say, well, this never happens, this is so outrageous, this is absurd, then he would probably not have written this. And there's a number of these epigrams.
And I guess that's a reflection on the fact that you would have something of a cross section of society in the baths. So presumably you have to pay to go to the baths, right? So that would exclude some people.
Yes, well, to first come back to your first remark, absolutely. So the large baths, not only in Rome, but also in other major Roman cities, were the social hubs where basically every inhabitant of that city would go to. These baths, by the way, were usually free of entrance, so there was no need to pay a fee. People would go there, would meet other people from all layers of society, meaning that members of the elite would also make clear that they were members of the elite, first of all, by paying as a benefaction the entrance fee for people with less money, but also not going there on their own, but showing up with a huge number of clients, of people depending on them. So, this would also be a statement of male, but also female elite members, that they were important persons in their cities. In Rome, of course, it would be the emperor. We also read in our sources about emperors who, of course, had their own luxurious private baths, where they, by the way, would also invite other people. But a good emperor would also go to the public baths in order to be visible for his subordinates, for the people of Rome.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like there is a tension between two slightly contradictory elements in these large public baths. One is that you're going in and you're getting naked with all the rest of society, and the other is that it's a place for display
Yes,
and prestige.
yes.
And Sadi, have you got anything to say in relation with that?
Yes, just to add to what Nathalie was saying, we do have also the sources that mention that rich people going to the baths were followed by throngs of slaves that would attend to their every wish, and that these rich people would also keep on their jewelry. You would recognize these members of the elite by their rich earrings and rings, which are often also found within the drains of these baths. We have a lot of these type of gold jewelry that comes out of these drains, and that actually confirms that people actually wore their jewelry at the baths and just to display how rich and famous they really were.
Absolutely. So even if people were naked or had very few clothes, social distinctions would always be visible for people who knew the codes. This is very much about cultural codes, about knowing how to behave, what to do, where to come, where to get. So it would still be clear to the visitors of these baths which people were members of the elite and what persons were of lower social classes. So the distinction would not go away. I would stress the fact that also these huge public baths were places where social distinctions were actually made clear, exactly for the reasons that Sadi was just referring to.
I think that's a very important point to think that, of course, when we come as modern people to think about this material, we bring certain assumptions, but we should try and deconstruct those by looking at the evidence and understand that there are codes operating in society that are different from our own codes. So I'm fascinated by this idea of finding things in the drains. What other kind of equipment or accoutrements would you have in the bath with you? Presumably you'd bring your grooming kit with you, or would there be things available in the bath, Natalie?
There was no soap in the
Ah,
sense of our modern soap. People would clean their bodies with olive oil and scrapers, and that sounds a little bit creepy, but with these scrapers, you would remove the dust and the dirt from your skin. And this was, of course, made possible by the oil, so you wouldn't hurt yourself. The idea was that because of the raised temperatures, the pores would be open, and then you would easily get rid of the dust and the dirt on your body. And of course, then making use of water would finish off your personal hygiene.
so do we find a lot of these scrapers and other grooming articles in archaeological sites?
There's a lot of museums showing these scrapers, strigiles in Latin, but the scrapers are in nearly every museum, and very often also small flasks that were used for oil and even perfume. So after the bathing experience, people would also use different kinds of perfume to smell nice.
Interestingly, most of these strigiles have not been found at bathhouses. These often are found in burials or within house contexts because these were the personal objects of people. And you can imagine that a strigiles, which is quite large, it could be 20, 30 centimeters long in iron or even sometimes in bone or whatever material, that those objects were not frequently lost at the baths. And these were personal items that people took back home with them. And the same goes often for the bath clogs. People wore a type of wooden shoe, like a wooden sandal, which is still the case in modern day hammams. And they would probably take home these bath clogs with them.
Objects that were found often in baths, also in military baths, interestingly enough, are hairpins. And these hairpins, in most cases, we think objects that were used by women. So this also made clear to researchers that even military baths were not places where women would never come. For the private baths, where sometimes people assumed that these were only used by the male house owner and his guests, and also excluding women, the find of these hairpins also tell another story. So in these cases, material culture objects tell us something about the use of both private and public baths.
If I remember correctly, there are also children teeth found in some bathhouses, so that also points that children would accompany their mothers to the bathhouse. And we also know this through some inscriptions of unfortunate children that drowned at the baths.
Adding to the wooden clocks mentioned by Sadi, it's also the other way around. We have in a number of baths, also private baths, in the doorway between the tepid, so the lukewarm, and the hot room, we have depictions in a mosaic of sandals. And this seems to be a kind of reminder, don't forget your sandals, because here the floor is really hot. This was the result of floor heating. So Roman bathing rooms, the warm and hot rooms, would be heated by floor systems. Underneath the floor, the hypercaust system would heat the rooms, and these floors that would function in practice as radiators. So the floors and the walls would provide the radiant heat that made the atmosphere in these rooms also very nice, very for a human body. It's nice. Well, it's the modern radiators we have at home, isn't it? But these floors, we also read about this phenomenon in our text. These floors could become very hot, and then the depiction of sandals in the entrance would remind people, don't forget your sandals.
Very practical. Yeah, I wouldn't want to get my feet burnt just as I'm going to have a relaxing experience. Just, I'd like to take you back to this question of gender in the public baths. Do we have evidence of mixing? So, do women and men go at the same time, or are there separate hours? Certainly in the Middle East, we have baths, both baths that are just for women and also baths which have different times, maybe a day for women or certain hours of the day. What do we know in the Roman period?
For the Roman period, again, there's a variety of possibilities. We have bath buildings, not only the very big ones, but also smaller baths offering two separate sections. So, most likely, one section for male visitors and one for the women. And one can also tell this that the connection to the outside field and the swimming pool where men would exercise is usually way more easy from the men's sections than from the women's section. So there was the possibility of a division within the building, also with separate entrances in some cases. In Pompeii, for example, the stadium baths, the women's section has its own separate entrance from the street. So they would never enter the palestra, the open field, the sporting field. We also have inscriptions referring to separate hours for women and men, with the vision that the women would be the first ones to use the bath, which perhaps is actually nicer because then the water was cleaner. But prime time, after work, before the evening meal, this was the moment that men would use the bath. So that's a separation in time. But we also read about mixed bathing, and not always in a very negative tone. Yes, of course, there are sources telling us that emperors like Hadrian prohibited mixed bathing, and there's a number of these emperors prohibiting mixed bathing, which, by the way, tells us that this was obviously practice, perhaps not common practice, but it was possible. But we also have other texts, and these tend now and then to be neglected in research about Roman bathing practices and bathing culture. There is, for example, a very moving inscription on a tomb in southern France near a Roman town, but the Romans buried their dead outside the city, so there was a clear distinction between the city of the living and the city of the people who had died. And this inscription, this text, tells us something like, you passing this tomb and this text, enjoy life because life is short, and I wish that you can still go to the baths with your wife the way I enjoyed so much with my beloved but now deceased spouse. That's a very moving text, but it also tells you something about happy couples going to the baths together. And I think it's in a way comparable to later practices, including in our own society. If one nowadays go to a sauna, we usually know where to go and when to go. So there are sauna baths with special days or hours for women or family hours. There's also men only saunas. With also some examples of saunas where most of the visitors are homosexual. And this is not the kind of information that is perhaps written down, but you just know this. When you live in a city, you know where to go and when to go.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we shouldn't think of it as one kind of institution, but multiple different sort of intersecting institutions.
Exactly.
Sadi, did you have something to add?
Yes, well, getting perhaps a bit ahead of ourselves, but I can also add that in late antiquity we have even Christian authors who still fulminate against people going to the baths together, same sex homoerotic interactions, but also men bathing with women. So, even in this really late period where you would think that the church has already a high impact on society, we still have these mentions of men and women bathing together, even in all Christian society.
That's great. Yes, we will get onto that. But I just want to ask before we get on to the later period, maybe we should pivot to, well, Nathalie's mentioned Pompeii several times, and you've done a lot of your research there. I'd just like to understand a bit about Pompeii in the sort of in our histories of bathing culture. How does it figure? And I guess the region of Campania in southern Italy that Pompeii is located in. What is the significance of this region and this site for understanding the development of bathing culture?
The significance of Campania and the cities around the Bay of Naples is high. This region of Roman Italy is important for various reasons if we want to understand the rise of baths and bathing culture. But there is one caveat. We tend, as researchers, to look always at Pompeii. And I'm perhaps the wrong person to say this because a lot of my academic work took place and still takes place in Pompeii. But there is this risk of over interpreting what we see in Pompeii and Herculaneum, thanks to the excellent preservation of these sites, which is the result of a paradox, of a disaster, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. But the state of preservation of these cities and villas around the Bay of Naples is exceptional. And now, for us researchers, our task is to understand what is normal to Roman towns in at least Roman Italy in the first century BCE and first century CE, and what is exceptional. Because Campania was also a very rich region, so it's not the average Roman region in the Roman Empire. This was from the third century onward when Rome came into contact with this part of today's Italy. It was already a flourishing region, cosmopolitic, with contexts also in the Eastern Mediterranean. But that makes it, for people interested in baths and bathing culture, a very interesting and important region because situated between the south of Italy, where the Greek influence on baths and bathing practices was high, and Rome, the region of Campania has served as a portal, so to speak, as a gate for Rome to get more experience with bathing practices, but also technology. that was only later implemented in Rome itself. Campania was also important because we see the merging of two Greek Hellenistic buildings and facilities. On the one hand, the gymnasium, so the building where men would exercise, physically exercise, but also hear the lessons of philosophers, for example. So it was for both physical and mental training. So that is the one part that merged into Roman bathing habits, at least for the male visitors. And the balaneion, the bath with separate bathtubs where in the Greek world people would take a seat and wash themselves. And the merging of the balaneion and the gymnasium is something we see for the very first time in Campania, in Pompeii. And this is not to say what one sometimes reads in all the textbooks that this was the place where this all happened, Pompeii. But at least in Campania, we have the impression that the Hellenistic traditions merged, and it's very visible still in Pompeii because of the exceptional state of preservation. So, both on a cultural and a technological level, if we speak about baths and bathing techniques and bathing practices, culture, this region is very important. And that's why, of course, we can't do without Pompeii and to a lesser extent Herculaneum, but also the villas with private baths in around the Bay of Naples. But always we need to think about to what extent is this standard Roman or is it exceptionally Campanian?
Right, that's interesting. So, even before Roman power expanded into southern Italy, do we call it occupation, conquest of Campania? Even before then, is it true to say that there was a distinctive culture which included a distinctive bathing culture, or is this Greek influence in the south? It comes after the Roman expansion into this area.
It's both. Campania has also hot springs, so there
Hmm.
is a longer tradition, and it's on the one hand difficult to prove, so to speak, because we don't have written sources about this, and archaeology does help, but it's difficult to exactly date. But most scholars agree that in Campania, with the hot springs in this area with Mount Vesuvius, a volcanic area, that people used, for example, the natural steam that in parts of the region around the Bay of Naples, well, was there, that people used this for bodily hygiene. That's one aspect. A number of the settlements and later on bigger cities around the Bay of Naples had a Greek origin, and at least the contacts with the Greek world via the south of Italy, but the eastern Mediterranean at large, where Greek culture was dominant, was there. So the idea that the hypocaust, the floor heating system, was a Roman invention is not any longer believed by scholars. This is what you find in all the textbooks, but it's simply not true because we have older hypocaust systems from a Greek context, and the word itself, by the way, is also Greek. But it's a very Roman phenomenon, so we have written sources from the first century BC onward telling us that this was a Roman invention, labeled with a Roman name, but that's typically Roman to come up with a Roman inventor and then appropriate, so to speak, this invention and to make it into a Roman one.
Is it true to say then that key aspects of what become distinctively Roman bathing culture are first imported from Greece into southern Italy, where you have a very high level of Greek settlement and cultural influence, and then that gets absorbed into the core part of Roman culture and then spread around the Roman Empire as distinctively Roman? Is that accurate to say?
Even more complicated, perhaps, that southern Italy in a mixed Greek and non Greek context, but that this was the region where the first hypocausts were actually built. So it's regarded very much as a southern Italian and Sicilian phenomenon. And we do have also some hypocausts in mainland Greece, but the majority was found in the south of Italy. So that seems to be the
Okay.
the region, the area where this new technique of floor heating was first experimented with.
Okay. I think we should move on to the later period then. So, Sadi, you work on baths in a later period. You mentioned already the word late antiquity. What do we mean by the period late antiquity? When does it start? When does it end? Does it include the Islamic period, for example, the early Islamic period?
Well, it all depends on the scholar and the region, of course, and the research tradition. I myself follow those who consider the start of the Tetrarchy as the start of late antiquity, and the Islamic conquest and the Lombard invasion of Italy as the end point of late antiquity. So, roughly speaking, from the early 4th to the late 6th, middle of the 7th century CE.
Okay. Um, and so, how did baths develop under Roman rule in this later period, and including in the Middle East and North Africa? Was there a bathing culture in the Middle East and North Africa before the Romans came? And how did this distinctively Roman style of bathing arrive in the Middle East?
Well, of course, you had the Greek style of public baths, those very characteristic buildings with round rooms, a tolos as they call it, in which there were individual bathtubs placed one next to each other. So bathers would come and bathe together, but each in their own individual tub. And so this was a type of public facility that became widespread within the eastern part of the Mediterranean, mainly in the Hellenistic period. And we have these type of Greek balaneion, as they call them, so a public bathhouse, as far as Egypt. It was very popular in Egypt, but also, for example, in what was later Roman North Africa, in Cyrenaica, for example, we do have some examples of this Greek style of baths. On the other hand, we also have private bathhouses that have been found in Punic settlements. For example, in Kerkouan in Tunisia, we have a whole neighborhood where small public bathtubs are found in private houses. And so there was definitely some sort of bathing culture already known to these people even before Roman introduced their large balnea and thermae.
And what was the process by which Roman bathing culture came to the Middle East and North Africa? Was it an intentional policy of bringing these, let's say, particularly public baths, visible public buildings, or did it happen by sort of accidental transmission of sort of ideas and practices?
This is a difficult question to answer because the archaeological data we do have of these first phases is poorly understood. There is few data because these early phases are, of course, underneath later phases of cities. The early examples of public bathhouses that we do have from, for example, North Africa, do seem to imply that it was more or less of an imported form. We have architectural layouts that really closely resemble contemporaneous baths in Italy. So these were probably more or less imported rather than being an adaptation of Roman ideas by local people. On the other hand, in later periods, we do see that these Roman baths were actually integrated within the urban fabric and that were slowly being adopted, but also adapted to local styles, local tastes, local architectural styles, local decorative schemes, etc. So there's always this component of adoption, but also adaptation.
So you say there's a sort of synthesis of this imperial style and these regional forms. Do you still have these tubs, these individual bathing tubs? Does that persist?
It depends on the region. For example, the Greek style of bath with this individual tub is still very popular in Egypt and continues to be built even in the first and sometimes even the second century CE. In other regions, we find bathtubs mainly in private contexts, but again, it's more the Roman style bath that is becoming the standard. So, with large communal pools in which two or more people could bathe at the same time. So we do really see a shift from this individual type of bathtub, but next to each other, to these larger communal pools. And that is also one of the characteristics of Roman bathhouses, going all together in the same pool.
Right. And so, what other sense of cultural difference can we see in the Middle Eastern and North African examples? Are there any other clear signs where there is something local that persists?
Yes, for sure. It is very important to understand that every region had some variations in architecture, in decorative schemes, but also in technology that was actually influenced by local customs, but by also by longer standing traditions from even before the Romans conquered these regions. And so, for example, in North Africa, you have this construction technique that is called the opus africanum, which is clearly different from construction techniques in, for example, Italy. But you also have very high amount of figurative mosaics, polychrome figurative mosaics in North Africa. North African mosaicists were very known for this. And so this is like a very recognizable way of decorating Roman bathhouses. Whereas in Italy, we do see them, but these are often in black and white mosaics. And so these polychrome mosaics are, for example, not restricted to, but very popular in North Africa.
Absolutely. And there's also the aspect of the natural environment. The baths in England, for example, Roman Britain, better put. A number of these show heated dressing rooms. And of course, with the climate in that part of the world, one can imagine that it's nicer to undress in a warm room. And this is something you probably, well, I don't know examples, perhaps Sadi does, but I don't know of any example in North Africa or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean with heated dressing rooms.
No, I don't. And that was one of my following points as well, that in the bathing infrastructure, we do see a preference for large cold rooms and large open air swimming pools called nataciones, which we, for example, almost do not find in the northern part of the empire. Other typical elements in North African bathing architecture are the very experimental forms that are often very popular: polygonal rooms, oval forms, curvilinear forms that do exist in other parts of the empire, but that seem particularly popular in North African bathing architecture. If we move more, for example, to the Middle East, you see there that there is a very slow introduction of Roman bathhouses and bathing practices. And this has been explained by some scholars like Stephanie Hoss due to the very strong Jewish religious feelings that had, of course, their own ritual ablutions, and so were more a bit restricting against Roman bathing habits. So here in the Middle East, and especially in the Jewish territories, there are only few bathhouses from the imperial period, and it is only in late antiquity that we see Roman baths breaking through and gaining popularity.
That's interesting. I believe there's also a similar phenomenon with toilets, that these multi-seater public toilets where you're, sitting next to somebody is less common in and around Jerusalem in Palestine. Fascinating stuff. And let's actually move on to this question of religion then. You raised this idea before, Sadi. So in 312, the Emperor Constantine, we are told, converted to Christianity and then confirmed this in the Edict of Milan a year later. And then scholars argue about the spread of Christianity, but clearly the strong Christian identity of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire is very visible in later years. Um, so you and Christianity, of course, it's a monotheism, but it's also a religion that highly prizes asceticism and the renunciation of the body. So you would expect, I suppose, some kind of reaction to bathing culture, which is very much about indulging the body, right? But you say this is not so. What is the range of responses that Christian authorities have to baths and bathing culture?
Well, to start with, it is a misconception that the Christian clergy per se was against bathing. We have, as you said, a number of different responses to the bathing habit. But the main response seems to have been to allow people to continue bathing as before. And we must remember, just as Nathalie explained, that this was one of the most popular and most day to day pastimes and popular ways of spending a day for Roman citizens. And so it would have been a strategic mistake by the church to abolish this very popular pastime. But of course, there are, as in every religion, some rigorists that virulently opposed bathing. But what is interesting is that we learn from the sources that the alusia, so the act of not washing, being the state of being unwashed, was actually restricted for a very specific group of Christians, for special categories such as ascetics, virgins. And so these were actually the exceptions within Christian community. And it was specifically because they refrained from bathing that they were a special category. So not to bathe was seen as an act of rebellion against the normal order, as a kind of a withdrawal from society. You did not partake in daily life and in daily activities such as bathing, but you were above that. You were thinking not about your earthly body, but only about the soul. For example, we also have some literary attestations that even the clergy went to public baths. And there's even a very famous quote in Socrates Scholasticus, I think it is, that when asked why a certain bishop went 2 times a day to the public bathhouse, he simply answered, because it is inconvenient to go 3 times. And so we see that even the clergy had no problem at all with going to the baths.
What about issues of nakedness? And do we not have stories of prostitutes in bathhouses? Are these not objects of criticism?
Well, these have been obviously objects of criticism by Christian authors, but we must mention also that these criticisms had already been voiced way before, also by non Christian authors. And this was considered a problem by some people, not from a Christian point of view, but from just a general moral point of view. So it were not only Christian rigorists, as I might call them, that had a problem with this, but this was considered to be a problem by people with a very Puritan view of society, I would say, at large, rather than being exclusive for Christian authors.
Yes, exactly. We talked about Marshall already a little bit, and also in his poems, in his epigrams, we find references to prostitutes, to people selling their bodies, trying to sell their bodies. And for Romans, at least for Romans from the elite, the problem was that everybody working with his or her body, with your hands, so not only prostitutes, both female and male prostitutes, but also gladiators, sportsmen, theater people, basically even people who work with their hands, carpenters, etc. This was in Roman elite eyes an inferior way of leading your life, because the real life was, and of course they could think this way because they were wealthy, the real way of living your life was own a lot of land, have other people do the work for you, make a living from the profits, and you spend your time as a Roman citizen on politics, on the military, and in your free time on philosophy. But that's, of course, a very ideal situation and not always matching reality, not even for these members of the elite. But the general attitude towards people who worked with their body, including prostitutes, but not only prostitutes, the prejudice was enormous. So that was one of the major problems. And this is, as Sadi rightly put, not a Christian problem, but it's a phenomenon in the Greco-Roman world at large.
That's fascinating. Certainly, for when we move into the Islamic period, in the very early Islamic period in the texts in Hadith and Islamic law, we see there's an anxiety about nakedness for sure. Also, there's an anxiety about hellfire because you have these large, I guess, furnaces burning, heating of the water. And so there's some sort of imaginative association with hellfire there. So, what about then sort of positive associations with bathhouses in late antique Christianity? Obviously, baptism is a key ritual of Christian initiation, which involves immersion or sprinkling in water. Do we see any association with that? Are there any shared facilities, or are there any sort of conceptual connection between bathing in the public baths and things like baptism or other aspects of Christian ritual or ideology? Sadi, maybe.
Well, of course, the fact that baptism was like a ritual washing of the body obviously posed problem to the Christians because they had to position their religious washing vis-a-vis the normal washing in the bathhouse. And so we see that, or what the written sources tell us, is that baths were still considered to be indispensable in maintaining a good health. So the medical ideas about the human body, it being a balance of different bodily fluids, these medical ideas had not changed. But to wash at the baths and to get rid of the daily dirt did not mean that one could clean his soul there. And the Christian authors are very keen in stressing this. So, making the distinction between a bodily superficial cleaning and the cleaning of the soul. And so, the cleaning of the soul could only be achieved by the sacrament of baptism. But what is also abundantly clear from the text, and especially anecdotal evidence, is that baths continued to be very important social hubs. And so ecclesiastical authorities must have been aware of this important connecting aspect within society. And so they were also willing to give the communities these bathhouses and continue this tradition of bathing and then connecting it to their churches. And so we do have public bathhouses that were connected with churches, public bathhouses that were connected with baptisms and baptistries. And of course, such baths that were connected to baptistries could have served a function within the whole sacrament. So, first getting yourself clean before you would receive the sacrament. But on the other hand, it must have also been a very pragmatic choice of having the same water supply for both bath and the baptistry, having the same sewage system, etc., but also attracting people to the baths as a social hub within this whole ecclesiastical complex. So combining both the social function of church and connecting this to the already existing social function of bathhouses.
I love that idea of the pragmatic marshalling of resources, that you have two similar kind of institution that both need a water supply, and yes, why not put them together? We've had a very interesting conversation. We need to wrap it up pretty quickly, but I did want to hit sort of one last area which has constantly been in the air, but maybe let's make it explicit, which is this question of resources and, I guess, managing environment, managing the urban environment and also the natural resources. How did baths feature in urban planning, urban environments, both positively and negatively? Nathalie.
In various way, and I think the most important thing to stress in this respect is that there was awareness of this relation, resources, and operating baths. So the location of baths mattered. Where do you build your bath within your city? There is, in many cases, a direct connection to the building of an aqueduct and the building of baths. And this is not to say that these aqueducts would only supply the baths, so the water supply system for a city or even a number of cities would get better, but the connection between the building of an aqueduct with newly built baths is in many cases tangible. As it comes to the heating of the baths, enormous amounts of wood were needed. So we also read about benefactions of rich people donating like 400 charts of wood, hardwood, to the baths to have the baths heated for a couple of months or a longer period. This was expensive. This was expensive in the sense of not every area of the Roman Empire has large amounts of wood, of hardwood. So this, in some cases, had to be imported. So you get glimpses in your sources now and then about problems as well. And there is more and more research about areas in the Mediterranean, first and foremost Roman Italy, where already erosion started to be a problem in the late Roman period because of all the wood that was taken away from the mountains and the hills and creating major problems. And the wood, so is the idea, was also for building ships and not only for the baths, but the baths have played an important role here as well.
Sadi, do you have something to add to this in thinking about the place of bathhouses within the urban environment and the management of resources?
Yes, well, it has often been raised by scholars that a lack of fuel and a lack of resources, the cutting of the aqueducts, etc., has been of major importance in the disappearance, in the eventual disappearance of large Roman bathhouses. And while this certainly must have been the case in some regions, we also have good archaeological evidence of regions where no hardwood was available, that local communities did find ways in coping with this. So, for example, in Egypt, that they made use of dried cow dung to fuel the baths. There have even been examples in the Near East where we see that the bones of the butcher were used and tucked onto the fire to keep the fire burning, or that agricultural waste, olive pits, branches, etc., were used to fuel the bath. So we must really look at this in a case by case scenario rather than seeing it as one glove fits all solution about dwindling resources and spelling and ending the Roman baths.
And then, of course, this only stresses the importance, the central role of going to the baths in the daily lives of many, many people in the ancient and early medieval period. There's perhaps also a more positive note to make. The heating of both the rooms and the water for the communal pools was a very efficient system. So, with the same amount of wood, the energy needed, both the water and the rooms were heated. So, following the technological innovations, one could imagine that this was also because people were well aware of the necessity to make use of these resources in a very efficient way. So, use the same amount of wood to heat both the water for the pools and for the floor and wall heating, because this was all done with the very same amount of wood, the very same amount of energy.
That's fascinating. And I think this kind of insight is very important nowadays when we're increasingly thinking of solutions to manage resources. And I think the lessons of history perhaps give, if not clear solutions, but they allow us to think in different ways about how we interact with our environment and the use of resources. Sadi, did you have anything that you wanted to add or?
Well, something to round up and to certainly take away from this podcast about Roman baths is what has been mentioned a lot of times, is that Roman public bathhouses, private bathhouses, the bathing habit was so much more than just getting your daily wash. It was foremost a social event that was also deeply anchored within Roman society, within how Romans saw the body, how they saw society at large, what were your duties as a citizen. You had to take care of your own body, you had to look presentable to your peers, and of course, you had to be involved in the social activities, etc. And so this was also something that was picked up by the people in charge. And so they really had an interest in investing in these buildings. And so we have this self-reinforcing cycle of bathing being important to the society, being acknowledged by people in charge who were already investing money in it and investing more in it. And so we really have this phenomenon that is so typical of the Roman period and so important in everyday life on all aspects of society, actually.
And then just to close up with, are there any other projects of your own that you're working on or that you'd like to mention to our listeners?
I just published with a German colleague a book on the central baths in Pompeii. And one of the fascinating aspects of that research that is now finally presented in his monograph is that this was a bath building under construction. So when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, the building was not finished yet, so it was never used, which gave us the opportunity to first follow the working order. So we can really tell, okay, there were at least 2 building companies and there was one contractor specializing in baths and bathing technology. So that's one aspect. But it's also fascinating because these baths were built in the last years of Pompeii, the Flavian age, or the Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, the 70s CE. And this was actually a period in which Roman bathing culture was really booming, thanks to a number of technical innovations, a better system for wall heating, the invention of window paint. So it was now possible to create large window openings without losing all the warmth. And this is exactly the starting point for a major boom in bath building and bathing habits in the Roman world. But most of the baths built during this boom were used for not decades, but even for centuries. So in Ostia, in Rome, these baths were intensely used and because of that, renovated every generation. So we don't have the original ground plan as it was designed by the architect, the contractors, when the baths were first built in all these Roman cities. But in Pompeii, since Mount Vesuvius erupted during the construction phase, we actually have the blueprint of a typical late 1st century CE bath building designed right after the innovations that had taken place. And this is something that is quite unique, that makes this building quite unique.
Wonderful. And we'll put a link to that publication in the show notes so people can look at that. Sadi, is there anything that you'd like to mention, recent or current project?
Well, yes, I have just finished my research on Roman bathhouses in the northern part of the empire, so roughly modern day Belgium, which has been published as a monograph also with Brepels. It is called Bathing at the Edge of the Empire. And on a further note, together with my colleague, Dr. Konogan Beaufet of the Center for the Study of Classical Architecture in Cambridge, I will be organizing an international conference on Roman baths and agency that will take place in Rome between 18 and 20 of October 2023. So this is also a warm invitation for all those interested in baths to come to Rome and come visit me and also Nathalie de Haan and all my bath expert friends in this wonderful eternal city.
Fantastic. And I hope you'll go and visit some baths. I hope
We
you'll
sure
take
will.
some time to relax.
We will.
Okay, thank you very much. That was wonderful. So I'd like to, say thank you. That was a really fascinating hour. And thank you for being here and hope to have lots more conversations in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's all from us today. Thank you for listening.